Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, and this is our lesson for week 3. A couple of really big topics. The first one is relativism, the issue of moral or ethical relativism versus absolutism. And then the next is freedom and determinism. So, relativism or absolutism, the basic idea behind these concepts is that relativism is what it sounds like. Things are relative. So, if a person asserts moral relativism, they're saying that morality and ethics and so forth vary from group to group, from culture to culture. And that's actually something I think that most people generally adhere to agree. But there's varying degrees when it comes to relativism. So if you're a mild relativist, that means you basically have a respect for the views of others, and um, you respect the ability of others to have their own ideas about morality in life. An extreme relativist would basically say that anything goes, that effectively there's no moral code, there's no wrong or right. Effectively, you would be a nihilist, meaning that you believe in nothing. And so, in an extreme sense, a relativist, you know, could take the position that basically there is no moral high ground for you to judge or evaluate the actions of others. The reason I have these two pictures here is because these two images are both examples of the danger of both relativism and absolutism when they are um, unchecked, if you will. So, cultural relativism, I'll talk about the images in just a second. Cultural relativism is the idea, basically, that cultures vary. And so if you take a universal cultural relativism position, you say cultures vary, and so if one culture is doing something that we think is terrible, well, their morality is different than ours, and so we can't criticize it. And so going to the first picture, the picture at the top, of course, is a picture from 1934 of Nazi Germany. A person who took a universal cultural relativist position would say, well, we might think that what's going on in Europe with the Nazis in terms of the things they were doing to Jewish people and Slavic people and so forth, a universal cultural relativist would say, well, we can't criticize that. We can't say that what they're doing is necessarily morally wrong. That's obviously a huge problem with taking a universal cultural relativist position because what the Nazis did, of course, was wrong. But if you take a universal cultural relativist position, it leaves you unable to judge or criticize a group like the Nazis for the crimes that they committed because you simply say that, oh, well, moral behavior, and ethics are all down to the specific um, culture in question, and so you cannot criticize it. On the other side of things, if you're an absolutist says that there are absolute moral values, there are absolute models of wrong and right. And I have attached a cartoon. This is actually the United States. This is an image or a very racist cartoon depicting Teddy Roosevelt before he was president. This is Teddy Roosevelt during the well, actually, this might have been during his presidency, but this depicts Teddy Roosevelt um, in his leadership of the Spanish-American War in Cuba and the Philippines, and the cartoon depicts the kind of white Western um, uh, imperialist carrying a indigenous person up the mountain to a schoolhouse. The idea here is that the white man's burden, which was the motive for imperialism, was that Western culture was superior, and it was superior in terms of its moral principles, in terms of its educational principles, in terms of its government, and that Western societies had a responsibility to go and force the people that it imperialized effectively to their um, to their system. And so imperialism, and as you see, it's extremely racist, of course, but imperialism, whether the United States empire that was established in the late 1890s, early 20th century, or the bigger empires like the British Empire, were often justified on the basis of cultural absolutism, with the idea that Western cultures were somehow superior, and this gave them the right to force other cultures to become like them against their will and at great cost and consequences to them. So there's problems with both these positions. In truth, there's probably a moderate kind of middle road to both of these, meaning that in some respect, moral codes and values are relative from culture to culture, but not universally. And in other respects, there are aspects of absolutism that absolutely apply in terms of how we see human rights, in terms of killing another person, in terms of torturing other people. There are certain absolute and relative principles. But when you take it to the extreme and you become a universal cultural relativist, then you find yourself unable to criticize, for example, heinous acts, whether of the Nazis or of a group like the Islamic State, for example, today. But if you take a cultural absolutist position, you say the United States' way of understanding the world is universally correct in all cases, then often that is used to justify actions that are often very repressive and racist and destructive to other people in the world as well. So relativism and absolutism, generally speaking, you cannot accept either one of the poles, one of the extremes. You have to create a perspective in which you have a mild and moderate way of understanding moral truth in the world. Excuse me. The other big issue is the issue of free will or determinism. Free will, basically defined as the ability of an individual to make a choice that is free and not constrained by fate or other factors, meaning that you can make a free action. Now, I think free will is one of those things that people naturally tend to assume is true. We have free will. You can make the choice you want to make. You can create yourself however you want to create yourself, so on and so forth, right? But does free will exist? Do we really have the ability to make completely free choices? Or are the choices that we make actually predetermined? Are the choices that we make determined by our surroundings, determined by where we're born, determined by the opportunities in terms of wealth, in terms of the society that we're born into? So I think we oftentimes believe or want to believe that free will is just a kind of almost goes without saying, that we have the freedom to make choices, and that we either make the right choices or the wrong choices. But in reality, it's just like the relativism versus absolutism. It's far more murky and complex than this. In truth, scholars on a lot of levels, great scholars over the last 200 years, have on many levels refuted the idea that there can be a complete or that there is any kind of total free will. And it's not only scholars, it's also religious groups. So determinism is the idea that there is no uncaused consequence, meaning that determinism means that there's always something that causes something else. So there's no consequence, there's no result, there's no end that is brought about in and of itself. There is always something that determines the next step. Determinism is, it has problems as well, but determinism historically has been very popular amongst a number of different groups. The Puritans and the Pilgrims, who of course came to Plymouth Rock and Massachusetts Bay in the 1600s, were Calvinists. And as Calvinists, they believed in what we would call religious determinism. And religious determinism was the idea that basically God was all-knowing and all-powerful, and God had chosen one way or another the people that would be selected to have salvation. And so for the Puritans, religious determinism meant that effectively there was a select chosen few, and that in life there was nothing you could do to actually make yourself one of the chosen few. You could do things to see if it would be revealed to you that you were chosen, But at the end of the day, there was nothing that you could do to complete your salvation. So that's how some religious groups believe. And of course, the Puritans, um, the founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the United States in the 1600s, of course, was one of the most noted of the religious deterministic groups. Of course, there's problems with that, obviously. One problem with religious determinism is if everything's determined by an all-knowing, all-powerful God, then how do we handle the problem of evil in the world? Because then that would be something that, of course, in some way, shape, or form, it would be logical, could have been allowed to occur by an all-knowing, all-powerful God. So there's religious determinist groups like the Puritans who don't believe there's anything you can do to actually earn your salvation. In the scientific and historical realms, we also have a number of different determinists. Scientific determinists, individuals like Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, in a way, they're also determinists because they're saying, Isaac Newton says, everything that you do is ultimately determined to some degree by natural laws that dictate the nature of and the function of human existence. Charles Darwin, we are to a larger, the father of evolution, the theory of evolution. We are largely determined by mutations and genetic transformations that we have no control over at all. So, on a very basic level, certainly there's a degree of determinism in terms of existence. There's also historical determinists. Now, historians today would be far less inclined to take a historically deterministic approach. Historians today, I speak as an individual whose specialization is as a historian. My PhD is in history, and I will tell you that historians today, we very much believe that history is contingent. That is, it's down to subtle changes over time, and it is not determined over the long time, but yet rather it changes and it's brought about by certain events and choices of actors over time. But historically, there have been some very powerful thinkers who have accepted that there is a process determining the future, the grand shifts in history. Karl Marx, who is also sometimes described as an economic determinist, of course, the father of the Communist Manifesto and of revolutionary socialism. Also, George Hegel, who is another historian that influenced Marx. Both Marx and Hegel believed that humanity was passing through predetermined stages. And for Marx, Marx believed that humans were in an evolutionary path towards a perfect society. And he believed that the steps were all determined. So you went from monarchy to capitalism, then capitalism would become so exploitative that capitalism would cause such misery amongst the people that in such inequality that people would rise up and they would ultimately, through a revolution, establish a socialism, and then eventually they would evolve into a communism over a long period of time. Karl Marx believed that these were predetermined events, that this was going to happen, that it had to happen, that the economic systems from monarchy to capitalism to socialism to communism were all necessarily linked in a deterministic path. So for Karl Marx, capitalism was absolutely fundamental. It had to happen. It was determined to happen. Other determinists, psychological determinists, like Sigmund Freud, who's pictured above Karl Marx's picture here. Freud, of course, was the famous psychologist, and Freud very much believed that much of the things that people did were predetermined. He believed that people were driven by their unconscious. And to give a basic example, Freud believed that a male child would always ultimately gravitate towards his mother, and a female child towards the father. The first, known as the Oedipus complex. And so he believed that it was the psychology, he believed it was the psychology of individuals that determined the kinds of decisions that they would make. Also, B.F. Skinner, who was a behavioralist. A behavioralist believes that, like Pavlov training the dog to salivate. You guys know that experiment, I hope. But Pavlov found that he could basically determine by establishing a process, a consistent process. Pavlov determined that you could actually condition people to behave a certain way by subjecting them to um, a repetitive sort of process over time. And so B.F. Skinner was a famous behavioralist who believed that you could and should organize society to be like Pavlov's dog, meaning that you could organize society so that everyone would behave appropriately. And you would have people behave appropriately basically by conditioning them, training them, if you will, to react a certain way, which again, it would be a form of determinism. There's also fatalists, and actually fatalists are very common. You probably all know a fatalist. Some of you might actually be fatalists. A fatalist is a person who believes that, when it's your time to die, it's your time to die. A fatalist is the person who believes that things happen for a reason, that fate is kind of dictating the ultimate path of your life. That is also a form of extreme determinism. That's hard determinism, meaning that it's a universal determinism. A fatalist believes that the things that happen to you all happen because there's a kind of predetermined meaning for those happenings. So these are some of the various types of determinist thought. So freedom or determinism, which one is it? In truth, scholars do not agree, but in truth, it's probably like relativism and absolutism. It's probably in the middle somewhere. There is almost absolutely no free will. There's no true free will because we can't control where we're born or who our parents are or how much money we're born into or what kind of education we get or what kinds of illnesses might befall us, what kind of accidents. There's so many things that happen in life that we cannot determine, that we cannot, bring about just by our choice, that it makes true free will really an unreality. There is no true free will, but there is some degree of freedom of choice. I think many scholars would suggest that the amount of free choice that we think we have is probably far less, that in many cases there's a variant of uncontrolled factors that go into a person and a person's life and their choices. But certainly I think many scholars would believe there's at least some degree of free choice, but far less than one might like to think. And so pure free will is probably not, in fact, pure free will does not exist. I will say that with certainty. However, it's also unlikely that there's a total determinism or a hard determinism, meaning that everything is determined. In reality, it's probably somewhere in the middle. And scholars would debate and argue about, is it more towards free will or do you lean more towards a determinism? But in reality, it's probably somewhere in the middle. Many of the things that occur in our lives and are brought about are predetermined by circumstances that we cannot control, whether it's genetics, whether it's where we're born, whether it's when we're born, who our parents are, how much money we have, things that befall us without any control that we have. And I think that most would say that there's a lot more that is determined than that is based on free choice. And of course, in American society, we really like to feel that, well, I made the choices, I made the right moves, I made myself. And to a degree, that can be true, but usually not nearly to the degree that an individual who thinks that. It's usually never to the degree that they actually believe that. There's actually many, many, many forms of fortune and opportunity, things that come to a person that are beyond their control. And so freedom or determinism, like absolutism or relativism, it's probably in the middle somewhere. And in the case of freedom and determinism, there's probably more that is determined by other things around you than there is free choice. In reality, the amount of completely free choice that a person makes, I would say, is very, very small because everything has a cause. There can be no choice in a vacuum. And so complete free will is definitely not a reality. Even though some thinkers, certainly an ethical egoist, if you remember Ayn Rand, would certainly believe that choice is paramount, and it is. An existentialist philosopher would believe that an individual makes free choices, that can dictate and determine their life. And so, to a degree, this is true. We do make important choices. We do, to a degree, make ourselves and create ourselves. But we often, I would say, do not have nearly the amount of free will that we actually believe we do. Anyway, that's it for today, and I hope this is not too long, and I hope it's helpful, guys. Thanks.